Donk betting the turn is an important source of win rate because it comes up more often than people think, and a lot of players tend to understudy it or don't understand the nuances behind it. So in this video, I will walk through 5 hands I played recently where I donk bet the turn. I will go through each one in the hand to note replayer first, and then look at the solver strategies in GTO Wizard. So here's the first hand. We have ace-6 suited in the big blind, the button opens to 2.5x, and we defend. And flop is queen 6-3, button goes b33, and I think this is a pretty standard call. And I would say that the most common situation to donk bet the turn is after we check call flop and the second card pairs. And so on this turn here, since we have a 6x advantage, but button still can have some trips, I thought we wanted to lead for b25, and I chose to include this combo. We could donk for a larger size in spots where either villain doesn't have many trips in their range, like maybe against a larger flop bet from an earlier position. And I did kind of regret betting this combo after the hand, but let's explore that in the solver in a moment. So anyway, we did donk bet for b25 and the button called. And on the river, I decided to go for a check raise. The ace is good for in position, and they could obviously be betting some ace-x, and we do unblock their air like 5-4 and 7-5 suited that could possibly get here this way. So I decided to check, and my opponent checked back, and we win against queen 9. Another mistake I thought I might have made in this hand is that I could see a good argument for betting this combo, since we do block the ace-x hands that villain could bet with, and we obviously would like to get value from queen x and maybe pocket kings that would check back. So let's take a look at this hand in GTO Wizard. Okay, so here's the sim. Let's edit button's bet size to b33 since that's what they did. And against a b33, we should actually be check raising ace-6 suited a good amount with the backdoor flush draw. A benefit of that line is we obviously deny some equity to hands with 2 overcards against the 6, and then we also have equity when called, but obviously calling is fine too, so I went for the call, and the turn was the 6 of clubs. Okay, yeah, so we do want a leading range, and b25 is the preferred size, but we actually want to pretty much pure check our ace-6 combos. I think the reason for this is because when we bet so small, like when we're just going b25, villain needs to be calling with almost all of their ace-x combos. So let's take a look at their response real quick against a b25. Yeah, I mean, they can fold ace-deuce, but even ace-7, ace-8, pure continuing. And so we have 100% equity against those combos, and so it's better to unblock those combos when betting with our trips and check this one to keep some trips in our checking range and to keep villain's air in the pot. Whereas if we look at a bunch of our other 6x combos, they can mix bet and check, but certainly betting at a pretty high frequency. So I think that is really important to keep in mind here when we are value betting trips with a b25 donk bet on turns. We should probably just be inclined to check with an ace. And that heuristic is quite logical and should be pretty easy to remember and keep in mind going forward. However, again, we do bet and villain calls, and the river was the ace of clubs. And yeah, we see here that we want a super, super high checking frequency at 94%, and we're only going for a B300 with around 6% of our range. That's obviously going to be quite polar. Probably no worse than trips for value, and then we can obviously incorporate some bluffs. We shouldn't really get here with ace-6 since we should be pure checking the turn. However, if we do get here with it, it does look like it tends to perform better as a bet. Again, sort of for the opposite reason that checking the turn is good. In this case, we block the hands that we want to bet, i.e. ace-x. And so, yeah, I think just betting to try to get value from weaker hands here is going to be the best line. So a couple good takeaways from this hand, and let's move on to the next one. Okay, here we have 10-7 off in the big blind, the button raises and we defend. Flop is king 9-6, and here my opponent goes b50, and I think we should usually be calling with our 10-7 combos. We can probably mix in some raises with a heart. So I chose to call here. Again, the second card paired, and since button bet b50 on flop, I do think it's going to be not super polar, but somewhat polar, and therefore they are going to be checking back a good amount of their 9x, and we still have plenty of 9x in our range. So I decided we want a donking frequency here, and so I go b25 with my 10-7, and my opponent called. On the deuce of diamonds river, I decided to bluff with most of my 10-7 combos with no spade and no heart, but usually give up with a spade. So I just went for a check and my opponent bet, and we have an easy check fold. So let's see what the solver thinks about this one. Okay, so the solver actually likes a small overbet for button, but let's change their bet size to b50. And against a b50, if we look at our 10-7 offsuit combos, yeah, it does look like we raise with the 10 of hearts at a pretty decent frequency, but mostly calling the other combos. So we call, turn is the 9 of spades. And yeah, it looks like we're donking for b25 at around a 20% frequency. If we look at our 10-7 offsuit combos, pretty much all of them are mixing, so donking sometimes is fine. So we do go for the bet. And after our opponent calls, the river is the deuce of diamonds. So I was, again, sort of curious if we need to be bluffing our combo or if checking is fine. And yeah, it does look like if we implement a strategy of basically just pure bluffing with the diamond club combos and pretty much pure giving up with the others, that's going to be pretty fine. I did have 10 of clubs, 7 of spades, which is the combo in the bottom left, and that pretty much pure just gives up. So yeah, it looks like this hand was played pretty well, and let's move on to the next one. Okay, now I have a couple 3-bet pot hands I want to take a look at. In this one, we open middle position with 6-5 suited, the cutoff 3 bets, and we go for the call. Flop is 9-6-4. We can maybe look for some flop leads here, but I go for a check. And my opponent goes b67 and I call. And here the turn is the 8 of diamonds. I think this card gives us a big flush advantage, and we still probably have a set advantage as well. So I decided to incorporate a donk betting frequency here and include this combo sometimes. So I went b25 here and my opponent called. And on this river, I thought we usually wanted to bluff with this combo, so I went for a jam, and here my opponent folded. So let's take a look at the solver. Okay, so we actually do get a significant flop donk betting frequency since we have so many more sets than cutoff. If we take a look at how many sets are in our range, it's 10.2%, whereas if we look at the cutoff's range, it's only 1.4% sets. So pretty huge advantage here. And I would actually bet that if we change the 4 of spades to like a 5 of spades, we could maybe even pure donk bet, because these mid straight boards are super high flop donk bets out of position in 3-bet pots. So it's not quite pure, but we are donk betting 75% frequency. Just real quick, I know this is a tangent, but I kind of want to see if we can just pure donk bet here. Our pot share for betting this frequency is 58.1. And if we node lock to pure betting, yeah, so it actually goes up 0.1%. So I do think this would be a good flop to just pure donk bet for b25 on. However, let's go back to the actual hand. And we do check. And cutoff goes b67. And we can see we are pure calling our 6-5 suited, so we go for the call. And the turn was the 8 of diamonds. Okay, so here we do get a pretty significant turn donk betting frequency as well. If we take a look at what percent of our range is flushes on this card, it's 17%, whereas it is just 10% for cutoff. And again, we do still have a huge set advantage. I'm curious why we don't have pocket 8s. Okay, so on the flop, it looks like we're actually just raising or folding the 8s with no diamond, which means on the 8 of diamonds, we just should not have any pocket 8s actually. So that's good to know, but even without a set of 8s here, we do want to be donk betting. And if we look at our 6-5 suiteds, they all get in there at some frequency. However, the size the solver likes is b48, And so let's take a look and see if our pot share changes. If we do go B25, our pot share here is 57.1 and it stays the same. And so I'm just going to keep going for B25 because it is easier to implement. And here frequency with our 6-5 suiteds seem to pretty much stay the same. So we go for the bet and opponent calls, and the river was the 9 of hearts. And yeah, here it looks like we get one size of all in. And if we look at our 6-5 of clubs, they almost always want to jam as a bluff. So yeah, we did go for that jam and our opponent folded. And here's the next hand. All right, here's another 3-bet pot. We open Jack 10 suited under the gun at a 6-handed table. And the cutoff 3-bets to 3x. And I think we have a pretty straightforward call. So I go for the call. Pure checking this flop, and opponent goes B33, and I call. And the 9 of hearts turn gives us a significant straight advantage here, since we play Queen 10 suited this way pretty much pure, and we also have more 9-9 as well. So I decided to go for a donk bet here for B25, and my opponent just folded. Let's take a look at this one in Wizard. Okay, so Wizard wants B71, but let's change that to B33. B33 with range seems to be perfectly fine here for the cutoff. And we are pretty much pure calling our Jack 10 suiteds and notably calling most of our Queen 10 suiteds as well. And turn is the 9 of hearts. So this is pretty interesting. Wizard wants us to donk bet for B100. I think this can make some sense just because we can play super polar here. And if we look at cutoff's range, they hardly have any straights at all. So they are effectively capped here, whereas we are uncapped. However, before we dive into this, let's check out the EV difference or the pot share difference between this strategy and playing a B25 strategy. So here our pot share is 61.3 with the B100 donk strategy. And okay, it actually goes up to 61.5 if we go down to B25. So obviously, you know, that discrepancy is probably just solver noise, but this strategy is perfectly fine. And in fact, the frequency is so high here that probably we can just donk bet range. Let's sort of node lock for that. Again, pot share is 61.5 and it stays exactly the same when we just go B25 with our entire range here. So this is a pretty cool spot to find. And obviously I like just donking our whole range for B25 because it's easier to implement than any other donking strategy. And again, against this bet, our opponent just folded. So let's move on to the last hand. Okay, one more hand here, and we're going back to single raise pots. The button opens and we defend the big blind with Jack 7 suited. Flop is 9-8 deuce rainbow. And button goes B67. And we call. We can probably mix in some raising, but I went with call this time. And again, since our opponent bet pretty large on the flop, we should have an 8x advantage here. And so I decided to go for B25 with a turn donk bet. And my opponent called. And on the river, I figured we have some better combos to bluff with, like 7-6, 7-5, 10-7, 10-6 combos. So I decided to check with this one. And this was kind of a funny spot. My opponent min bet. Since we only have to have the best hand less than 5% of the time for a plus EV call, I thought there was enough like 7-6, 10-7 stuff, basically all the stuff I just mentioned that we could be bluffing with, plus maybe even like 5-4 of clubs type stuff, that I think we have a pretty clear call with Jack high here. It doesn't work out this time because my opponent has Queen 9, but I do think it's important to realize how much showdown we do have here. Granted, not a ton, but I think plenty enough to call with against a min bet. So let's see what the solver thinks about this turn donk spot. Okay, so we obviously pure check flop. Our opponent goes B67. And if we look at our Jack 7 suiteds, occasionally we can raise, but usually calling. So we go for the call. And the turn was the 8 of clubs. And yeah, here indeed we do want a super high donk betting frequency, donking for B25 at 73%. What is interesting here is that Jack 7 suited especially non-clubs, actually usually chooses to check. So it's obviously fine to bet some of the time, but might be worth reining in a bit. And if we go B25 and they call, and the river is the 8 of diamonds. Okay, so this actually was a mistake to check with this combo. It looks like we usually should be bluffing with it, in addition to, a bunch of this weaker stuff as well, except for the clubs, because we would rather unblock their folds. And I think the reason for this is because we do have really a lot of combos in our value range for B40. We have a ton of 9x, a fair amount of 8x, and villain can certainly get here with a bunch of like ace highs and king highs that we'll need to fold. Then it does seem like we, just do need to be turning jack 7 into a bluff most of the time. So that's one good takeaway from this spot. And the last thing I want to look at is, let's look at our turn donk betting frequency again at 73%. But let's take a look at what would happen if, instead of button betting B67 on the flop, they had just gone for a less polar strategy and gone B25. So if they go B25 and we call, and the turn is the 8 of clubs. So now we still do get some donk bets, but a much lower frequency. And again, the reason for this is mostly because button still has plenty of trips, since they're basically just like betting range for B25 here on flop. So I will wrap things up here, and hopefully we should all be able to approach turn donk betting with more accuracy and attention. If you found this helpful at all, consider subscribing for more no limit strategy videos, and I will see you in the next video.